P. Diddy, imprisoned for several crimes, made a decision that no one expected. He called the prison priest, confessed to his darkest crimes, and now wants to be baptized and start a new life. After years of secret parties, manipulation, and destroyed lives, he claims to be remorseful and seeking redemption. But is this enough? Do you think P. Diddy deserves forgiveness, or should he rot in hell for everything he did? In today's video, you will hear the priest's account of the prison where P. Diddy is being held, where he revealed everything the rapper said, and said that he is very sad and depressed in prison and wants a new life in the church. What do you think of all this? Leave your opinion in the comments and subscribe to the channel to receive more videos like this. The father's report begins as follows. When P. Diddy arrived at the prison, I remember immediately noticing the shadow of a man who seemed to be carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. He was not that icon of power and confidence that everyone saw in the media. He was just a human being broken. The expression on his face was one of pure despair. He barely looked into the eyes of anyone who crossed his path. At first, he isolated himself in his cell, refused to interact, and spent most of his time with his head down in complete silence. I approached him one of the first days, but he seemed resistant. "What can a priest do for me?" he muttered, almost as if he was laughing at himself. He was a clearly lost man with a wounded soul. He didn't say anything about the accusations at that moment, but you could feel the weight of the truths he was carrying. He was in internal conflict, and guilt seemed to consume every part of his mind. One day, while distributing prayer books in the cells, I saw that he was sitting alone with his eyes staring into space. So I left one of the books next to him, without saying anything. It was at that moment that I noticed a small crack in the armor he had created around himself. He picked up the book, held it for a few seconds, and I could see a lone tear running down his face. It wasn't just sadness, it was regret. That was the beginning. It was there that I understood that as much as P. Diddy seemed like an irretrievably lost man, there was something about him that still sought redemption. In the first few days in prison, P. Diddy seemed a shadow of his former self. The weight of his surroundings was visible in his every movement. He walked through the corridors as if he were carrying a ton of guilt on his shoulders, always with his head down, avoiding eye contact with the other prisoners and even the guards. It was as if he was trapped in his own mind, constantly reliving the accusations and scandals that had led to his downfall. My first real interaction with him was almost accidental. I was passing by his block, handing out spiritual reading materials and exchanging some comforting words with the inmates. When I arrived at his cell, he was sitting in the corner, his arms crossed over his knees, staring at the floor. He didn't even look up when I approached. "Sean," I said, using his name instead of his nickname. "If you need someone to talk to, I'm here." He looked up for just a second, with an expression that mixed disdain and wariness. "To talk," he replied in a hoarse voice. "And what exactly can a priest tell me that I don't already know? You just repeat the same thing, don't you? Sin, repentance, forgiveness. This doesn't erase anything." I was silent for a moment, because I knew he was testing the waters, looking for a reason to reject any kind of help. But at the same time, there was something in his eyes, an almost imperceptible gleam of someone who wanted to believe but didn't know how. "Maybe don't erase what you did," I replied calmly, "but it may change what you still do." He didn't respond, just looked away. But something about that interaction opened a door, however small. Over the next few days, I kept running into him in the hallways. He started watching me, but always from a distance, like someone who is curious but doesn't yet trust. It was only when I found him in the common area, where he was absently leafing through an old magazine, that he made the first gesture of approach. He looked at me and asked, almost defiantly, "Do you really believe someone like me is fixable? I mean, you've seen what they're saying about me. It's a lot of dirt." That was the first time he opened a chink in his armor. I sat down next to him and said, "I don't know everything you did, Sean, but I know the guilt you feel is trying to tell you something. It wouldn't be so heavy if you didn't care. Maybe this is your chance to listen." Diddy was silent for a long time. After that, he started looking for me. It wasn't straightforward, but he seemed to be testing me, checking to see if I really believed what I was saying. He asked short, often provocative questions, such as, "What if someone doesn't deserve forgiveness?" Or, "Do you think God really cares about rotten people?" These conversations were the beginning of something bigger. It was as if he was trying to convince himself that there was still a chance for him, even as he fought his own skepticism. He would never admit it directly, but each time he spoke to me again, It became clear that he wanted to believe there was a way out, that he was not beyond salvation. At the end of the first week, he finally agreed to meet with me in a private session. It was there that everything really started to change. The initial barrier of resistance was breaking down, and he began to open up, albeit slowly. The first time P. Diddy agreed to meet with me privately was a tense moment. He entered the prison's small meeting room with slow, almost hesitant steps, as if he were trying to decide whether he should really be there. He sat in the chair opposite mine, crossed his arms, and stared at me in silence for what seemed like an eternity. "So, Father," he began, his voice low, almost a whisper, "where do you want to start? Want to hear about what a monster I was? Or would you rather talk about forgiveness and redemption?" There was sarcasm in the question, but also a hint of pain. I told him it wasn't about what I wanted to hear, but what he needed to say. This disarmed him a little, and he looked down at his hands, which were restless on the table. After a few seconds of silence, he began to speak, not with great revelations, but with small pieces of truth that seemed to escape almost against his will. "The life I lived out there," he said, taking a deep breath, as if the words were difficult to come out. "It was all a facade. Money, fame, power. It seemed like the dream, you know. But behind the parties, behind the cameras, there was a hole that I was trying to fill with women, with drinks, with drugs, with anything that made me feel alive, even if it was just for a few hours." He hesitated, as if deciding whether to continue. I remained silent, allowing him to take his time. Then he began to describe the parties he threw, events that the world saw as extravagant, but which he knew were much darker. "Have you ever heard of the dark room?" he asked suddenly, looking me straight in the eyes for the first time since arriving. Before I could respond, he continued, "It was where the boundaries disappeared, where no one had a name and no one had a face. Things happened in there, things I don't know if I can even describe." He began to confess how he manipulated the people who went to these parties. Many of them were young, aspiring celebrities or ordinary people who were fascinated by the chance to get close to an icon like him. He used the power he had to convince them to do things that in any other situation would be unthinkable. Diddy also talked about the other celebrities who participated and helped him cover up what was happening. "It was like a silent pact," he said, rubbing his hands together nervously. "Everyone knew, but no one spoke, because if I spoke, I would lose everything. And that included me." The tone of his voice changed when he started talking about the people he hurt, not just directly, but also indirectly, through the environment he created. "I turned a lot of people's lives into hell, Father. And do you know the worst? At the time, I thought it was normal. That was just the price of fame. Now, sitting here with my life destroyed, I can't understand how I got this far." He spoke slowly, as if he was reliving each moment. As the words came out, it was as if he was finally looking at the pieces of his own soul, all scattered and irreparable. He ended the first confession by saying something that stuck in my mind. "If there is a real God, he must hate what I have become." When he finished speaking, there were tears in his eyes. He wasn't openly crying, but it was impossible not to notice the vulnerability there. I knew this was just the beginning, the tip of the iceberg of everything he was carrying. In the following sessions, P. Diddy began to reveal more details, delving into a confession that seemed to free him and at the same time destroy him emotionally. Not only did he talk about the events he organized, but he also started dropping names. High-ranking people from the music industry, film industry, and even politics. It was as if he was ripping a bandage off a wound that had never healed, exposing everything that had been hidden for decades. "It wasn't just me," he said, his tone firmer than in previous confessions. "There was an entire network. People you would never imagine. People that everyone sees as examples, icons. They were there at parties, in rooms, doing the same things, sometimes worse things." He mentioned how these public figures helped cover up excesses and abuses, ensuring that nothing was disclosed. According to him, silence was maintained through agreements, threats, and in some cases, millionaire bribes. "It was like a blood pact," he said with an expression of disgust. If anyone spoke, everyone would fall down. Among the accomplices he mentioned were names that would shock the world. Some were artists and producers who he said were the architects of the darkest parties. Others were record executives who provided the resources, money, security, even drugs to ensure things ran smoothly. They called it control of the environment, he explained, but really it was people's control. Diddy detailed how the dark room was the ultimate symbol of this culture of excess and degradation. There, people were not seen as individuals, but as objects to satisfy the darkest desires. There were no rules, he confessed, his eyes fixed on the table. People went in there and did whatever they wanted. It didn't matter who they were before they walked through that door. Inside, no one was innocent. He also spoke about the devastating impact of this on the lives of the victims. Many of the young people who participated in these parties never recovered. Some were emotionally destroyed, others lost their careers, and some went to the extreme of taking their own lives. I saw what happened to them afterwards, but I always convinced myself that it wasn't my fault, that they knew what they were getting into. Now I see how much of a lie that was that I told myself. The report became even darker when he revealed that some of these victims tried to expose what was happening, but were silenced. He mentioned stories of veiled threats, of campaigns to publicly discredit these people, and in some cases of violence. They were afraid of me, he admitted, his tone bitter. I was the guy who had everything: money, lawyers, influence. I could crush anyone who tried to open their mouth. Finally, Diddy took a long pause before concluding. I always thought this was all just the price of power. But now I see that I destroyed lives, and every face, every name comes back to me when I close my eyes. There was something deeply heavy in his words, but also a small hint of relief. It was as if he was finally releasing something that had been eating away at him for years. However, I knew that confession was still far from complete. After weeks of intense confessions, I realized something was changing in Diddy. He seemed to be fighting an internal battle between continuing to open up, or returning to the armor of denial and self-protection he had built up over the years. But it was on one particularly dark night that the real turning point happened. He called me to talk at the last minute, something I had never done before. When I arrived in the room, he was sitting at the table, restless, staring at the wall. As soon as I sat down, he started talking. Without introduction, without pauses. It was as if he had accumulated everything and could no longer hold it. I can't get away from this anymore. Father, he began, his voice shaky but firm. Every time I close my eyes, I see their faces. The people I used, who I destroyed, who I manipulated, to do what I wanted. No matter how much I try to justify it, no matter how much I say it was just part of the game, I know I was wrong. He held his head in his hands as he spoke, clearly tormented. Have you ever felt like you're carrying such a weight that you can barely breathe? That's what I feel all the time now. Every name, every face, every lie. They won't leave me alone. Then he said something that made me realize how close he was to a transformation. I thought I was invincible. I thought I had everything under control, that I would never get caught. But now I see that this was not control. It was the opposite. I was a slave to all of it. To the power, to the money, to the need to be bigger than everyone else. And everything I did was to feed that. He began to recall specific moments that tormented him. I remember a girl. She was 19, maybe 20 years old. I saw the way she looked at me with fear and hope at the same time. She thought I was going to help her, that I was going to change her life. But I just used it like all the others. Now I don't even know where she is. But I know I ruined everything for her. There was a moment of heavy silence before he continued. The worst thing of all, Father, is that I knew. I knew I was hurting these people, but I chose not to care. And now every wrong choice is coming back to haunt me. It was at this point that he asked a question that seemed to come from the depths of his soul. Do you think there is still a chance for me that I can change this somehow? I responded that the first step to any true change is acknowledging one's mistake. And that sincere repentance can open the door to redemption. But most of all, it said he would need to face the truth fully, both for himself and for those he hurt. It was the first time I saw a glimmer of hope on his face. It wasn't big, but it was enough to tell that something was changing. He was no longer just confessing. He was beginning to confront the choices that had led him to that point. That night, Diddy told me he was ready to start letting go of the past, even if it meant facing all the pain he caused. It was the moment he stopped running away and started facing the weight of his conscience. After that night, when Diddy finally confronted his conscience, something changed in him. He started reaching out to me regularly. But now there was a different tone to his words. It was no longer just regret. It was a genuine desire to find a way to make amends, or at least to give new meaning to his life. It was then that he said something to me that took me by surprise. Father, I need to ask for forgiveness. Not just to God, but to the people I hurt. I don't know how, but I need to try. These words were full of sincerity, and I knew it wasn't easy for him to say them. He was used to being the man who never admitted weakness, who never apologized. But now he was willing to humble himself, to acknowledge the harm he had caused. "I know, just saying sorry won't fix anything," he continued. "But maybe it's a start. Maybe it's the first step for me to be a different person." In the next session, we started talking about how he could do this. I encouraged him to start with a sincere prayer, something that came from his heart. At first he seemed hesitant, as if he didn't know how to address God. But when he started talking, the words flowed. "God, I know I don't deserve anything," he said, his voice breaking. "I know I did terrible things, that I hurt people, that I was selfish and cruel. But if the Lord can still hear me, I just want to ask one thing. Help me change. Show me how I can be a better person. Show me how I can fix at least part of what I broke." It was a simple prayer, but each word seemed to carry immense weight. When he finished, he was silent for a long time, as if absorbing the moment. Over the next few days, Diddy began writing letters. He asked me for help writing some of them, because he wanted to apologize directly to some people he knew he had deeply hurt. "I know they may never forgive me," he said, "but this isn't about me. It's about them. They deserve to hear that from me." These letters were not just apologies. They were honest confessions in which he detailed what he had done wrong, without trying to justify his actions. He wanted the victims to know that he recognized the harm he had caused. At the same time, he began attending prayer meetings in prison, something he had previously ridiculed. At first, he was silent, just observing. But soon he began to open up and share his story with the other prisoners. He said, "I don't know if you believe in redemption, but I'm trying. Not because I deserve it, but because I need it." These moments were small but significant. It was as if he was beginning to build a new foundation for his life, one that was not based on power, fame, or wealth, but on something deeper and truer. At the end of one of the sessions, he said to me, "Father, for the first time in years, I feel like I am breathing. It's not easy, and I still hate myself for a lot of things, but at least I feel like I'm trying to do the right thing." The moment P. Diddy decided to convert was as powerful as it was unexpected. After weeks of reflections and confessions, he called me to talk. This time, there was a firmness in his voice that I hadn't noticed before. "Father," he said, looking straight into my eyes, "I want to leave all this behind. I really want to change, but I know this isn't just about talking or writing letters. I need something bigger. I need to surrender. I want to convert." It was a moment that left me emotional. Until then, he had shown signs of transformation, but this decision was something that came from the bottom of his heart. He knew he was making a commitment that would sacrifice humility and, above all, a complete break with the past that had destroyed him. Over the next few days, we began to talk about the meaning of conversion. I explained that it was not just a change in behavior, but a profound transformation, which required a new way of seeing life, people, and oneself. He listened intently, asking questions and pondering every word. "What about my past?" he asked. "How can I move forward knowing that he's still there, that he still hurt so many people?" I told him that the past would not disappear, but that conversion was a way of giving it a new meaning. You can't erase what you've done, but you can use what you've learned to help other people, to stop others from making the same mistakes. Shortly afterwards, he made the decision to participate in a baptism ceremony in prison, a symbolic milestone of his new journey. On the day of his baptism, he was visibly nervous, but also determined. There was something different about his posture, as if he was freeing himself from a weight he had carried for decades. When it came time to give his testimony, Diddy spoke with an honesty that left everyone in the room silent. "I was an arrogant, selfish, and cruel man," he began, his voice firm but full of emotion. "I thought I could control everything, that nothing and no one could touch me. But I was wrong. I destroyed lives, including my own. And now all I want is a fresh start. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I may never forgive myself. But I want to believe that God can still do something good with what's left of me." When he emerged from the water, there were tears in his eyes. He didn't try to hide them. For the first time, he seemed comfortable showing his vulnerability. After baptism, he began taking practical steps to break with his past. He asked his legal team to end any association with events or businesses that were linked to the lifestyle he previously led. He also began donating anonymously to organizations that supported victims of abuse and exploitation. "I can't change what I did," he told me in one of the conversations. "But I can ensure that from now on, my life is dedicated to something bigger than myself." The decision to convert was the point of no return. For him, it was more than a symbolic act. It was a commitment to a new life, one that he knew would require constant effort and humility. He wasn't just renouncing the past, he was building an entirely different future. After his conversion, P. Diddy began to demonstrate a genuine desire to use his experience as a way to impact other lives. He told me in one of our conversations, "I spent years being a wrong example. Father, if there's anything I can do now, it's use this story, no matter how dirty it is, to help other people not fall into the same traps." From there, he began sharing his testimony with other prisoners. At first, he spoke in small prayer meetings, still with some insecurity. But as he became more comfortable, his words gained strength. He hid nothing. He spoke openly about the mistakes he made, the void that fame could not fill, and the devastating consequences of his choices. "I thought I had everything," he said, "but in reality, I had nothing. Everything I built was based on lies, on destruction, and in the end, it consumed me. Only when I lost everything did I realize what really matters." The other prisoners began to gather in greater numbers to listen to him. Many identified with his story, not because they had lived at the same level of fame or wealth, but because they understood the weight of regret and guilt. He spoke honestly, without trying to appear superior or preach lessons, but simply showing his journey of fall and redemption. Additionally, Diddy began planning how he could impact lives outside of prison. He expressed a desire to create a foundation to help vulnerable young people, especially those who dreamed of fame and were willing to sacrifice everything to get there. He wanted to warn them about the dangers of falling into the traps of the industry, something he knew so well. "I see now that everything I called success was just an illusion," he said, "and if I can save one person from that path, then maybe my life will have some purpose." One of the most notable initiatives was when he started writing a book. It was not an autobiography to glorify his life, but a raw and honest account of the mistakes he made and the lessons he learned. He told me, "Father, I want people to read this and see what happens when you put ego and power above all else. I want them to see the price I paid and the price others paid because of me." Diddy also got involved in projects inside the prison, organizing talks and meetings to help other prisoners reflect on their choices and find ways to change their lives. He came to be seen as an inspirational figure to many there, not because he was famous, but because he was willing to face his mistakes head on and work to be a better person. At the end of one of these talks, he told me, "You know, Father, for the first time, I feel like I'm truly living, not because of what I have or what people think of me, but because I'm finally trying to do the right thing." Diddy's new purpose in life didn't erase the past, but it gave a different meaning to his present. He went from being just a public figure, marred by scandals, to becoming someone who actively sought redemption, positively influencing those around him.